The mud was still wet on Greta's boots, and the kitchen smelled like cold iron and river weeds when Roland threw the words at her. "Neighbor saw you in the ditch again," he said, jaw tight, "dragging rusted plough-blades like we're beggars. You shame me. They think we're paupers." Greta stood by the sink with her hands still red from the chill, one sleeve darkened where ditch water had splashed up. She didn't raise her voice. "It wasn't junk. I needed those pieces." Roland let out a short, bitter laugh. "Needed them for what? Another pile in the yard? Another reason for people to talk?" He pointed toward the window, where the last gray light of evening caught the outline of old metal stacked by the fence. "I'm done with this. Stop hauling scrap through this town, or leave." For a second, the room went so quiet she could hear the clock over the stove ticking and the soft drip of water from her trailer hitch outside. Greta looked at him the way a person looks at a house right after they realize it is no longer home. What hurt her was not only the insult, it was how easy it had become for him to say it. Roland had not always sounded like this. Once, he admired that she could make something useful out of what other people ignored. Once, he laughed when she came home with bent gate hinges and said she saw a heron in them. But somewhere along the way, his hunger to look respectable had grown louder than his love. And before that night was over, Greta would make a decision Roland never saw coming. If this story speaks to you already, like the video and subscribe, because some kinds of dignity deserve to be heard all the way through. To understand why that sentence cuts so deep, you have to know what Greta saw when she looked at old iron. She had grown up around fields, rain barrels, split fence posts, and sheds that smelled of oil, hay, and damp wood. Her grandfather never passed a broken hinge or a bent tooth from a harrow without picking it up. "Steel remembers," he used to tell her, turning some rusted piece in his hands as if it still had a future. Greta learned young that worn things were not always finished things. Some just needed another use, or another pair of eyes. That stayed with her long after childhood was over. While other people saw heaps of salvaged scrap metal, she saw movement. A hooked tine could become the curve of a wing. A length of chain could hang like reeds in the wind. Even before she married Roland, she kept a little corner of every place she lived for the pieces other people left behind. Roland had liked that part of her in the beginning, or thought he did. Back then, it made her seem earthy, practical, different from the polished women who watched every word at dinner parties. He liked telling people she was good with her hands. He liked the warmth of her, the steadiness. But admiration is one thing from a distance. Living beside a calling you don't respect, that is another. After they married, his world kept narrowing toward appearances. Better jacket, better contacts, better standing at the co-op. And each time Greta came home with mud on her cuffs and iron in the trailer, his smile got thinner. Then, one spring evening, she finished a side gate from old sides and worn fittings, and the first outsider who stopped to stare at it did not laugh at all. She asked who had made it. That woman was named Hannah Mercer, and she did not look at the gate the way Roland did. She ran her fingers along one welded curve, then stepped back so the late sun could throw the shadows across the gravel. The old sides made long, thin lines on the ground, like grass bending in wind. "Who made this?" she asked. Greta, who still had a smear of soot near her wrist, answered simply, "I did." Hannah nodded once, the way people do when they recognize something real. She said she worked in landscape design, that she was helping restore an old riverside property, and she had been searching for a piece that felt rooted in the land instead of bought from a catalog. Roland came out just in time to hear that part, and at first he smiled, but it was the careful smile he used when he was already calculating what something might look like to other people. After Hannah left, the lane still smelled of cut grass and warm dust. Greta stood by the gate with a kind of stunned quiet inside her. Someone had seen what she saw, the shape, The meaning. Roland should have shared that moment with her. Instead, his eyes went straight to the road. Did you have to tell her you found half of that stuff in ditches? He asked. Greta turned to him. Why would I hide it? Because people talk, he said, too quickly. Because there's a difference between talent and making us look desperate. She stared at him then, really stared, and in that pause, she understood something painful. Roland had not changed all at once. He had been moving away from her piece by piece. 3 days later, when Hannah called back with an offer Greta never expected, Roland was the one who picked up the phone. Roland held the phone against his ear, looking through the kitchen window at Greta's gate as if it had suddenly become a stranger on his property. Hannah's voice came through bright and clear. She wanted Greta to make a memorial piece for the riverside grounds she was restoring. A real commission, something with height, something that could stand through rain and frost, something made from old farm metal because, as Hannah said, that's where the feeling is. Roland's fingers tightened around the receiver. I'll tell her, he said, but his voice had lost its polish. When Greta came in from the yard, carrying her gloves and smelling of smoke, he repeated the message with a flatness that tried to turn good news into trouble. For 1 second, she just stood there. Then her face changed, more like a candle catching after a long, cold draft. She really said that? Greta asked. She said it, Roland answered. But don't get carried away. One woman liking your metalwork doesn't mean the whole town needs to see where you drag it from. Greta looked down at her gloves. The seams were stiff with soot. If the piece is for the river, it should carry the river. That was when Roland's fear sharpened. He had been hoping this hobby would shrink if he frowned at it long enough. Instead, someone had opened a door. In the weeks that followed, Greta worked harder than ever. She hauled bent plow teeth from wet grass, cleaned old chain with a wire brush, and sketched shapes on brown paper at the table after supper. And Roland began watching the road more than he watched his wife. The memorial commission should have brought peace into that house, but it brought a sharper kind of silence. Greta spent her evenings in the yard under a yellow work light, bending, cleaning, and placing pieces until the shape in her mind began to stand on its own. Sparks snapped against the dark. The air smelled of rain, scorched metal, and the lavender bush by the back step. Sometimes she forgot dinner on the stove because one curve needed another inch, one joint needed a stronger seam. Roland did not see devotion. He saw risk. At the co-op office, where he wore pressed shirts and kept his desk too neat, he began hearing little comments. Nothing cruel at first. Saw your wife down by the river. She's got quite a trailer of iron there. Making something, is she? They smiled when they said it, but Roland heard laughter even when there was none. By the time he came home one evening, his pride had turned sour. Greta was unloading rusted plough blades from the river ditch, each one heavy with mud. She had chosen them because their edges had been worn smooth by years of soil and water. To her, they looked like feathers waiting for a body. To Roland, they looked like shame. That night, the argument returned worse than before. You are not hearing me, he said, voice hard. People think we're scraping by. They think I can't provide. Greta wiped her hands on a rag. This isn't about money. No, Roland said. It's about respect. And if you can't respect this home, then maybe you shouldn't be in it. Greta looked toward the yard, where the iron lay shining wet in the moonlight. And for the first time, she did not argue back. Greta slept very little that night. The house had a strange coldness before dawn, the kind that settles into floorboards and makes every small sound feel too loud. She moved through the rooms with care, folding work clothes, wrapping her gloves, gathering her sketch papers, and setting her welding kit by the back door. Roland stayed in the bedroom. Whether he was asleep or only proud enough to pretend, Greta never knew. Outside, The grass glittered with frost. Her breath showed white in front of her face as she hitched the trailer and checked the straps around the plow blades. The old iron gave a low clank when she tightened the lash chain. It sounded final. She did not take much from the house: a coat, a tin box of savings, her tools, the sketches for Hannah's memorial piece, and the metal Roland had called shame. By sunrise, Greta had reached the shuttered smithy at the edge of the old road. Its sign hung crooked. One window was cracked. The empty yard smelled of coal dust, wet stone, and nettles. A woman who managed the property met her with a ring of keys and a look that asked no questions. "It's cold in there," the woman said. "That's all right," Greta answered. "I can work cold." The forge shed was bare, except for a scarred bench, a rusted vise, and soot darkening the rafters. But when Greta rolled up the door and morning light fell across her trailer of iron, she felt something open in her chest. For the first time, every broken blade, chain, and bent tooth could stand in plain sight. Then, behind her, a car slowed on the road and did not keep going. The car stopped beside the broken gate of the smithy, its tires crunching over loose gravel. Greta wiped her palms on her coat, suddenly aware of how the place must look. The crooked sign, the black rafters, the trailer full of rusted blades, and herself standing there like someone who had brought her whole life in one load. Then Hannah stepped out, holding a folder under one arm. "I went by your house," she said gently. "Roland told me you weren't there." Greta's face tightened, but Hannah did not ask the question most people would have asked. She looked past her into the open shed, at the plow blades catching pale morning light, at the chain coiled on the floor, at the sketches pinned to a beam with old nails. "This might be better," Hannah said. Those 4 words almost undid Greta. Better. Better. The memorial piece began there, in that cold shed, with numb fingers and breath turning white in the air. Greta worked through mornings when the metal was so cold it bit through her gloves. She patched leaks with tin sheets. She balanced heat, weight, and shape until the old iron started becoming something taller than grief. Hannah came by every few days, bringing measurements, hot coffee, and quiet respect. She never rushed Greta. She never called the material junk. Weeks passed. The Riverside Commission rose piece by piece. Curved blades like reeds, old teeth like seed heads, chain falling in dark lines that moved when the wind came through the open door. And when Hannah finally saw it standing finished in the shed, she did not speak for a long moment. Then she took out her camera. Hannah's photographs did not look like the shed Greta was standing in. On the little camera screen, the soot-dark rafters disappeared. The buckets, the leaks, the cracked floor, all of it fell away. What remained was the piece itself, tall and quiet, made from metal everyone else had stepped over. The old blades curved like river grass. The chain hung in dark lines. The worn teeth seemed to lean toward the wind. Hannah lowered the camera and said, "Greta, people need to see this." Greta gave a tired laugh. Her hair was pinned badly, her hands ached, and there was a burn mark on one cuff of her coat. "People have seen enough of me hauling iron." "No," Hannah said. "They've seen the hauling. They haven't seen what you do with it." That sentence stayed with Greta. It followed her while the memorial piece was moved to the Riverside grounds, while men with straps and pulleys lifted it into place, while the first visitors slowed on the path and fell quiet before it. And let me ask you something, because maybe you know this feeling too. If anyone has ever made you feel small for honest work, write in the comments, "My work has dignity." Sometimes one person needs to read that and remember they are not alone. A week later, Hannah called again. Her voice had that careful excitement people use when they are trying not to scare good news away. She had sent the photos to a committee connected with a juried design prize. Greta sat down on the bench, still holding the phone. "What prize?" she whispered. And Hannah said, "A national one." Greta did not answer Hannah right away. The shed was quiet except for a drip from the roof and the faint ticking sound of cooling metal. A national prize sounded too large for the cracked bench in front of her, too large for her coat with the burned cuff, too large for the woman Roland had told to stop embarrassing him. "What would they want from me?" she asked. "Photographs, a statement, a proposal for a new piece," Hannah said. "And I think you already have one." Greta looked toward the corner where several plowshares leaned against the wall. For weeks, she had been turning an idea over in her mind. A tall heron, the kind that stands at the edge of water like it knows every secret under the reeds. Its body would be made from old plough blades, its legs from rebar, its neck from chain and curved steel. While Greta began sketching that bird on a sheet of brown paper, Roland was losing the life he had tried so hard to polish. At the co-op office, his neat desk no longer protected him. A younger man was given the role Roland had wanted. Then came a quiet demotion, wrapped in polite words and closed-door meetings. Nobody shouted at him. Nobody mocked him. That almost made it worse. He went home to a house with no sparks in the yard, no iron stacked by the fence, no Greta humming under her breath while she worked. Just clean floors, silent rooms, and his own pride sitting beside him like unpaid debt. Then, one afternoon, a work email arrived about a regional artist shortlisted for national attention. The name on the announcement was Greta's. Roland read the email twice, then a third time, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into someone else's name. At the bottom was a small photograph of Greta standing beside the riverside memorial, her hair loose from the wind, her hand resting on one dark curve of metal. The caption called her work a powerful use of reclaimed farm iron. Roland stared at that phrase until his face warmed with something close to shame. At the forge shed, Greta knew nothing about him reading it. She was too busy building the heron. The bird began as chalk lines on the floor, then became piles of chosen pieces. Plowshares for the breast, rebar for the legs, a length of chain for the neck, welded so carefully it seemed to bend like a living thing. The shed rang for weeks with hammer strikes and the bright crackle of heat. In the evenings, fog pressed against the windows, and Greta kept working under a swinging lamp, her shoulders aching, her hands stiff, her heart steadier than it had been in years. Hannah helped with forms, measurements, and words Greta did not like using about herself. "Just tell the truth," she said. "Tell them where the metal came from." So Greta wrote about river mud, field tools, floodwater, and labor. She wrote that old iron still had a voice if someone was willing to listen. When the first official letter came, Greta opened it with black dust still under her nails. Her heron had been shortlisted. Then, several weeks later, another envelope arrived, thicker than the first, with a clean white seal and Hannah standing beside her, holding her breath. Greta turned the envelope over in her hands before she opened it. The paper was smooth, almost too clean against her rough fingers. Outside, rain tapped on the roof of the forge shed, and the heron stood behind her in the dim light, taller than both women, its iron body dark and still. Hannah said nothing. She only watched Greta break the seal. Greta read the first line once. Then she read it again. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Hannah stepped closer, eyes searching Greta's face. "What is it?" Greta handed her the letter. Hannah's hand flew to her mouth. "You won!" The words seemed to hang there with the smell of wet stone and cooling steel. Greta sat down on the bench because her knees had gone weak. She thought of Roland's kitchen, his voice, the way he had said paupers as if honest work were something dirty. She thought of the ditch water soaking her sleeves. She thought of every blade she had dragged home while people watched from warm cars. And now, that same metal had carried her name into a room she had never imagined entering. News moved quickly after that. There were calls, forms, a request for a short speech, and plans for a public unveiling by the river path. The committee wanted the plaque to explain the materials. Greta insisted on one line: recovered from the old river ditch and surrounding fields. When the co-op board heard the prize would be unveiled locally, they asked to attend as honored guests. Roland received the invitation at his smaller desk, under a flickering office light, and saw Greta's name printed above his. Roland sat with that invitation in his hand until the office emptied around him. The same board members he had tried so hard to impress were listed as guests near the front. Their names were neat and bold, arranged under Greta's, as if the world had quietly turned itself upside down. Outside his window, evening rain blurred the parking lot lights, and the paper trembled just a little between his fingers. He almost threw it away. Then he saw the line about the plaque. Materials recovered from the old river ditch. The ditch. The very place he had used like an insult. The muddy bank he had been ashamed of. The place where he had told Greta she made him look poor. Now it would be named in bronze beside a winning piece of public art. On the morning of the unveiling, the river path smelled of wet grass and fresh timber. Folding chairs stood in careful rows. The heron was covered with a pale cloth, but even hidden, it looked tall. People gathered in coats and soft voices, looking toward the shape with curiosity. Greta arrived without ceremony. She wore a simple dark dress under her work coat, and her hands, though clean, still carried the faint marks of heat and labor. Hannah stood beside her, smiling like someone trying not to cry. Then Greta saw Roland near the back. He looked thinner somehow, just smaller without his old certainty. Their eyes met across the crowd, and for a moment, all the noise seemed to pull away. Roland took one step toward her, but before he could speak, the host tapped the microphone, and the ceremony began. The host's voice carried over the damp river path, gentle at first, then stronger as people settled into silence. He spoke about land, work, weather, and the hands that had shaped the fields long before any plaque was planned. Greta stood near the covered heron with her fingers folded in front of her. She did not look at Roland yet. She looked at the river instead, sliding brown and silver beyond the reeds. Then the cloth was pulled away. For a moment, no one clapped. The heron rose above them, tall and dark, its plowshare body catching the pale morning light. The chain in its neck gave the shape a quiet bend, almost alive. Its rebar legs stood firm in the grass, as if the bird had stepped out of the river ditch and chosen to stay where everyone could see it. A woman near the front whispered, "Oh my goodness." Then the applause began. It came full and warm, spreading through the crowd until even the co-op board members were on their feet. Roland watched the men he had spent years trying to please rise for Greta with open respect on their faces. The host read the plaque aloud. When he reached the words, "recovered from the old river ditch and surrounding fields," Roland lowered his eyes. Greta stepped to the microphone. Her voice shook once, then steadied. "Some things are called worthless," she said, "but sometimes they were only waiting for someone to see what they still carried." The crowd applauded again, and when it finally faded, Roland was standing only a few steps away from her, with tears he could no longer hide. Roland waited until the last hands had shaken Greta's, until the board members had finished praising the work they once would have called strange. He stepped closer with his hat held against his chest. For a moment, he looked not like the man who had ordered her to leave, but like someone standing in front of the damage his own words had made. "Greta," he said, and his voice broke on her name. "I was wrong. I was ashamed of the wrong thing." She looked at him quietly. The river moved behind them, slow and brown, carrying leaves along the bank where the old blades had once lain half buried. "I kept thinking people would judge me," Roland said. "But I was the one judging you." Greta did not smile, but her face softened. "I forgave you before today," she said. "Not because what you did was small, because I didn't want to carry it into every piece I made." He swallowed. "Is there any way back?" Greta glanced at the heron, at the chain curved like a neck, at the plowshares brightened by rain. "Not to what we were," she said. "That door closed when you made me choose between your pride and my hands." Roland nodded. This time, he did not argue. When he walked away, the applause had ended, but the heron still stood above the grass. A bead of rain slid down one rusted blade and caught the light, turning the old scarlet metal briefly gold. Greta stayed until the chairs were folded and the river path grew quiet. If this story moved you, give it a like, leave a few words for someone doing honest work in silence, and subscribe for the next story.